My guest this week is Jim Gaines, former managing editor of Time magazine and the author of The Fifties, An Underground History. The book is interesting because it's about how, though we remember the 60s as the decade of great cultural change, how a lot of those changes took effect then, the groundwork was being laid in the 50s. And so he highlights some people who fought for equality in different areas well before we knew about it. They are unsung heroes. Here's the first segment of our interview.
Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I invited you on to talk about your latest book, The Fifties, An Underground History. And for those who haven't read it, what's so special about the 50s?
Well, it's famous for being repressive and conventional and conforming. A lot of pressure that I didn't feel because I was a little kid on my parents and their generation to be just whatever the government said to be. I mean, whatever the powers that be dictated, people were basically encouraged, if not forced, to conform. It was a period of McCarthyism and other repressive movements against gays, which, we shared that prejudice with Nazi Germany and Russia at the time, the Soviet Union, and against people of color and against just everybody who had any kind of instinct for breaking out of that social conformity. And the purpose of the book was to highlight those people who, because of their own issues, sought change and couldn't help themselves from seeking change. I was just thinking about Harry Hay, who started the Mattachine Society, which was the first sustained group of movement for gay rights, and Medgar Evers and his fellows in Mississippi, who came home so angry from the war. I mean, the image that I carry is Medgar Evers with his discharge papers, having served from the Battle of the Bulge to the end of the war in Germany, sitting on the back of a bus on his way home and having to wait while everybody else went in for lunch at a bus stop. He couldn't join them. Those stories and others about the environment, for example, which we were poisoning as hard as we could, and feminism, which was definitely antisocial at the time. So those people, and there are very few of them in the book, and there were very few of them in real life, actually took on these causes that were incredibly unpopular because of their own motivations. It's something they couldn't help themselves from doing.
And why do you subtitle it An Underground History?
Because they were in the underground. They were people who were not conforming and who hid until they felt they had enough support to come out of hiding. That doesn't apply to Medgar Evers. He was ready to have a shooting war in the United States as soon as he came home with his brother Charles. And they decided wisely, I think, to do it peacefully, relatively peacefully, I should say. But it was a very hard time to be a progressive.
So you write about 4 particular subjects in the book: gay rights, feminism, civil rights, and ecology. Why did you focus in on those 4 things?
Well, they were probably the least popular ideas. Several of the people in this book were in the Communist Party and fought in part through the Communist Party of the United States, which at least supported them. You can say what you want about communism, but the Communist Party, apart from the subversive activities that some of them undertook, was supportive of progressive change in the United States. It was about the only place that some of them could turn. That's why. I mean, I admired them tremendously for their courage. And I thought that history should continue to recognize them. This is not the first time that most of them have been mentioned, but I think it's the first time that we've shown that change has a different way of beginning from the way that's commonly thought. The conventional vision of change, or at least one conventional vision, was that it begins with the law. Because after you pass a law, hearts and minds will follow. But the fact is, laws are hard to change, and we're proving that every day. And really where change begins is in the lives and hearts of people who are dealing with those issues that need to change.
I definitely agree that that's the proper way to do it. And you're not going to get the legislation to pass anyway unless you can convince people and change minds. So it's interesting that you note that some people think that you have to change the law first. Well, none of those laws got changed until people were convinced that they needed to.
Exactly.
And then really quickly, since you mentioned that, so talk a little bit more about why were the communist organizations so sympathetic to these people's causes?
Briefly, I think they were sympathetic partly for political reasons. They were showing themselves to be different and to have something to offer. So I think some of it was cynical and some of it was principled. There were some very interesting and accomplished people in the Communist Party of the United States. It was thought, at least by them, to be what we would consider leftist. They weren't trying to overthrow the government of the United States. They were trying to, some of them, not the leaders, I bet, were just trying to make positive change. As an example, Gerda Lerner, who is the woman who she ran the first course in women's studies, and she ran the first doctoral program in women's studies. She was an early member of the Communist Party, partly because she came from Austria. She was an immigrant from Austria, and Austria had been taken over by Hitler while she was still there. No groups were more at each other's throats than the Nazi Party and the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And Gerda Lerner joined what she perceived to be the better choice. And there were really only two choices. If you were in Austria as a young woman, there were only two choices. And she chose what I would think would be the right one. But there came a time when she was in the United States and actually working with the Communist Party here for feminist issues. There came a time when she had to hide the fact that she had ever been a communist. And she hid it until almost the end of her life, when she wrote an autobiography that admitted all of it. That's just one example, but it's very like the others. So it was not what the McCarthy era thought of the Communist Party. It really was a reformist force. As I said, there were cynical leaders who did it for other reasons, but large part of the membership was simply idealistic.
So we got to get into these more specific sections. So let's start in an order with the gay rights and talk about, we'll get later on in the conversation into the madness we're into. We're going to flow into that. But a lot of people are younger now, right? So I think it's important to explain what gay people were experiencing, right? Because, I don't think a lot of people know just how bad it was. And you describe in very great detail the things that people had to endure just because of their sexuality. So talk about that, and then we'll get into, the specifics of Harry and Frank and what they did.
Right. Just as one example of the ways in which gays were discriminated against, and it's really much worse than that. At the State Department, there were a lot of gay men in the post-war period. Washington was kind of a gay city at the time, though it was far underground. The police used to stake out bathrooms in Washington, public bathrooms, in order to catch them and arrest them. They would also flirt with them and get them to try to commit, to have sex with them, and then arrest them and take them to prison. I don't think people recognize how bad it was. The best example I can think of is after World War II, when we were liberating the concentration camps, we did not set free the men with pink triangles on their shoulders who were there because they were gay. That was us. That was the Allies. That was Dwight Eisenhower. That was, it's really unthinkable. We gave them over to German authorities to serve out their sentences with no credit for the time they served in the concentration camps. That sort of gives you the idea of just how horrible gays were thought to be.
Coming up, more with Jim Gaines, author of The 50s, An Underground History. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
We return to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in May?
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Jim Gaines, former managing editor of Time magazine and the author of The 50s, An Underground History. And in the last segment, we talked about the fight for gay rights. And here we talk about feminism and how that was fought by some courageous women in the 50s and the unique takes there. And I set up the conversation on civil rights and highlight how complicated things were.
And then we move to feminism. So talk a bit about the pioneers you talk about there, Polly, Gerda, and Fannie Lou.
Yeah. I took the occasion to put Fannie Lou Hamer in the book as a feminist pioneer, which she was. There were, Gloria Steinem was in the movement at the time that Fannie Lou Hamer joined it too. But by then, where she lived, in plantation country, Gloria Steinem had not reached that part of the world. And Fannie Lou Hamer stood up for feminism as well as against racism at a time, Mississippi was not ready by any means. She was tortured at one point by the authorities there it was a very minor show of resistance. They sat down at a lunch counter on the way back from a citizenship meeting, and the police rounded all of them up and brought them to the jail and beat them mercilessly. Fannie Lou Hamer more than anyone. And she suffered from polio as a child and never really recovered from that beating. She was extremely brave. I mean, the best thing that I remember about what I read about her was how she would, in a demonstration when things got really dicey, when it looked like violence was going to break out, she would break out in song. And by the end of it, everybody had kind of made a leap over the problems that they were facing and were willing to face them together. She was a really important, strong, unifying figure in the South. And then I write about Gerda Lerner, whom I've talked about earlier, who started women's studies in the United States. She came here and married her ex-boyfriend in Austria, who had somehow found a way to get here. The marriage foundered because it was just a marriage of convenience. But she later married and had children, and had to leave the Communist Party, as she had to hide in Austria her progressive leanings. But eventually they came out in her academic work. But again, as I said, she didn't admit to being a communist.
And then Polly was interesting. Yeah, and the interesting thing about Polly is, and you write about some of this in the book, but one thing I've always said that's interesting is when you talk about all these things that people had to go through, you talk about feminism, one thing that they kind of lose sight of is, everything was compounded being Black. So, but Polly was interesting because you mentioned the thing with Fannie Lou and like how Gloria Steinem didn't experience feminism the same way Fannie did. But then Polly also had to the increased thing of going the other way, right? So how Black men who are going through the civil rights struggle, but how they were treating women, and particularly her, because she was basically living as a man. But, like dealing with that is a whole different level. So you got Medgar Evers and you have all those things with civil rights, but there was a female component to that kind of got lost, even though some of them were part of that struggle too. So her treatment was, yes, help us get civil rights where they need to be, but at the same time, we still think you have a place that's separate from us, right?
Thank you. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so.
I can't improve on the way you've put it. So.
Right, that's great, but I just think that's important for people to know. I mean, right. They understand these different layers and how things are bad, but some things are some of these fights were being fought at the same times, and some people just couldn't see them the same way others did. People experienced them different, and the best way to understand this is to understand all of them. So I'm glad you included her, and I think people should definitely read about that. But the one thing about... go ahead.
I should talk about Molly Murray, because as you said, she had multiple discriminations going against her. Even she was very light-skinned, and in grade school she was made fun of by other kids for her light skin, and later in life she suffered the discriminations against on the basis of race and gender and as you put it, it's about being a powerful female. I mean, she was powerful. I mean, she wrote the argument. She grew up with relatives because her mother died when she was very young, and she grew up with a mixed race. Her mixed race grandparents, and it just felt like she was in between everything, as she was. She was in between gender. She was in between race. And she felt very confused until she realized that she could turn these issues into power. And she ended up going to law school, and at the end of her, not the end of her life, but years later, she wrote the argument that Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to strike down sexual discrimination, period, in the case of Reed versus Reed. So all of these people that we're talking about derived strength in the end from their problems, from their issues, according to American society, and from their willingness to face them and declare that they were not weaknesses, they were strengths. And there were very few. There are people I don't mention, but there were very few who were willing to do that, or who were troubled enough by what they were suffering inside that they had to do something about it.
And then I don't want to, the last two, you have to pick up the book. We could go into detail on both civil rights and ecology, but we have to tie this to today at the end, right? So, right. But quickly, I just want to talk about, my listeners definitely know a lot about the civil rights movement, but you highlight the terrible and repugnant treatment of Blacks when they came back from the military. People kind of know Medgar Evers' story. You tell a little bit more. But one interesting piece about the civil rights we should talk about is the varying approaches, right? The violent versus nonviolent, like you talked about Frank. He's like, he was more militant. We need to get in their faces. I was talking to someone before, and they were, like we were in this battle for gun rights, and people, whatever your views are, I was laughing at some white Democrat who was trying to make the point about, how we shouldn't have guns, which is a fine point, but they tried to use Blacks as making the point and saying, well, Blacks could never own guns and Blacks shouldn't do this. Because people don't really know about, we had Blacks on the rooftop, like the Klan. We know the Klan exists. You come in our neighborhood, they trained us in the military. We don't play, right? Exactly. And even the king of nonviolence, King, was surrounded by people and protected by people who weren't, pacifists, so to speak. And you talk about Robert Williams.
Robert Williams is an interesting figure, and I suggest people look him up because it goes against the nonviolent narrative of the entirety of the civil rights movement, but also against this notion that blacks don't own guns or anti-gun or things of that nature. He started a rifle club specifically to fight against the Klan, kind of protected the nonviolent faction of the civil rights movement. And he wrote a book called Negroes with Guns or something like that about the importance of defending yourself and how he didn't agree with the nonviolent approach. He even had to flee to Cuba, he and his wife, to keep from being killed or attacked. So check him out. And we'll talk about more of the civil rights piece on the other side as we continue our conversation with Jim Gaines, author of The 50s and Underground History. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I'm continuing my conversation with Jim Gaines, former managing editor of Time magazine and the author of The 50s and Underground History. And in the last segment, we talked about the women's rights section of the book, and I ended by alluding to his points on civil rights. He focused a lot on Black servicemen coming back from the war and being viciously mistreated. But he pointed out how the threat of violence made the difference. And that's important to note in the time of thinking that we need to take everyone's guns away. Whatever your views on that, we can't ignore the fact that the civil rights movement doesn't happen the way it does and as quickly without these guns. And here he goes into detail about that and finishes up by talking about ecology.
The reason I wrote the chapter about Black men coming home from World War II was to give them the credit that they deserve for the way they protected the civil rights movement. It was a nonviolent movement that could have been crushed without the threat of violence by those men. And they were very well organized. And I mean, as I think I said before, that Medgar Evers thought about having a shooting war when he came back. He was so mad. And God knows we can understand that. Having been in Europe and having that breath of freedom, as Colin Powell called it, they were not about to come back and just go back into the hole that they had dug themselves out of. So, yeah, they deserved a lot of credit that they have not been given, at least in the histories that I've read. Robert Williams, maybe most of all, he was a very dangerous fellow. And he too joined the Communist Party at one point, but he was a very effective fighter for against things that happened to him in Monroe, to him and his fellows. So on ecology, you know, this issue is still happening, and the views that Norbert Wiener expressed in his books and articles are still not solved. He was an MIT mathematician, but he became a humanist and a critic of science as it was practiced and as it's being practiced today, where we feel that we can take charge of the planet. I mean, it was Genesis, I think, where it said that we were to multiply and dominate the earth. And we're still doing that. And it's had very deleterious effects, as he predicted. In the ecology chapter, I take two people who never met each other, but who came together in their views of how we were treating the earth. which to say badly. We were dropping radioactive materials on our citizens. We were thinking about how do we replace the rivers of the world? How do we make how do we deploy nature against enemies? Bats with radioactivity that would bite people. We considered all these things as legitimate ideas for not only warfare, but for just managing our property, with no thought to what we were killing in the process. And Rachel Carson, whose initial books were really about celebration of the sanctity of nature and how it was invulnerable to anything we could do to it, she came around too to Norbert Wiener's concern at the end of her life in Silent Spring, the best and most important book she ever wrote. She was clear about the fact that you can't just do whatever you want without paying a huge price. And it was almost a repudiation of everything she'd written before. But that is her heritage. That's her legacy. And thank God for it, because it led to the Clean Water Acts and the Clean Air Acts. But it hasn't sunk in to politicians today to pass a law. It was Wiener and Carson and people like her, and there were others, but not many, who laid down the perspective that we should be following today and are not. As much as anything, that lesson has not been learned.
Coming up, more with Jim Gaines, former managing editor of Time magazine and the author of The 50s. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I'm continuing my conversation with Jim Gaines, former managing editor of Time magazine and author of The 50s. And here I ask him his views on the notion we hear a lot that we are still fighting the same problems today that we were fighting then, the Jim Crow 2.0 type things. And we have some agreements and some disagreements. And I push back against the notion that we are facing the same fight today.
That's just not true. There's been major progress. I could also argue that all of those things still exist. The discrimination against gays, not in all parts of the country.
Well, that's the thing. That's where you and I kind of differ, in the sense that we could never correct that out of human nature. Can we correct it to the point that a gay, a black, and a woman can function and achieve in society? That is a win. We won that. It's not a debate. It's not still a fight. We won that. Would you admit you wrote about these people and you understand this movement? Do you think the fight of Medgar Evers or Pauly or Gerda and some of these others was to say, I want perfection?
No.
Or do they want their equal right? They have the rights they wanted.
Right.
But the fight is just as fervent. These people are as angry and as loud as Frank wanted to be today, as if that's the same. That is what my problem is.
I'm with you. Things are better. There's no question. I don't want to make this partisan, but we still have efforts, particularly in Republican states, to limit voting by Black citizens.
That's not untrue. There is not a Republican politician in office today that's saying, I want to do what I can to stop Black people from voting. Their goal is to limit Democrat votes, and it's no different than me in Illinois watching Democrats try to suppress Republican votes.
Okay.
Do we believe that they hate
That's
white
fair.
people? Of course not. They want to suppress the Republican vote. So they draw funny districts so the Republicans are weakened. I don't agree with it on either side, but to say it's a specifically black thing is factually inaccurate. If those blacks in Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia were voting Republican, do you think the Republicans would be trying to draw districts or limit their voting rights?
Of course not. Yeah.
So it's not race, it's party.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point.
I think nobody should do it. We need a constitutional amendment where this is the way, creating an even way you draw the district, and that's the way you draw it, full stop. Not little funny looking shapes with little circle over here so you can get more. Like I can send you stuff with it. In California, it's like we need more Hispanic districts. We need strong Hispanic districts so we can draw it where there are more Hispanics in it. They're not doing it because they hate or love Hispanics. They're doing it because they assume those Hispanics are going to be Democrats. It's no different than they say, yes, let's draw this. There's more blacks over there, and they tend to be Democrats. So we draw some of those out, we'll get more Republican. I agree it happens. I agree it's wrong. I just will not concede that they're doing it because they're anti-black.
Right. You make a very good point.
Well, look at the rhetoric they use. This is Jim Crow 2.0. No, it's not. It's some partisan Republican trying to draw a circle so he gets more Republicans. That is not Jim Crow 2.0.
No, I mean, no, Jim Crow
wrong.
is very different.
Right, that's what I'm saying. It's different from saying it's the same thing that Fannie or Medgar or Robert went through. It's not.
Yeah.
Like you wrote about these things and they're heartbreaking if you read this book, the things people went to. To say gays are still getting fired, right? Like you write about Bruce Scott. Bruce Scott's win, you and I agree what they did there was wrong, and that's a wonderful win. But Bruce Scott's whole point was, how dare you come to me and ask if I'm gay? Today we went from saying, who are you to ask, to you must now celebrate, right? So to say the fight is the same as outing Scott,
Yeah.
I'm not outing Scott. I'm not going after Frank. I'm saying it's wrong for you to force me to X. And that's why I think when a gay person says the fight is the same, when a black person says the fight is the same, when a woman says the fight is the same, it's asinine, whatever my cause is. And I think that's totally different from the fights we used to have. And I think that the rights will be solidified when people stop trying to, conflate everything that happens today to the things you write about in the book.
I think you make very good points. I mean, and I think the book does as well. It's not that these problems are completely gone. It's just it's much better because these people did what they did.
Right. The same thing with Norbert in the big tech, right? We talk about his problem was with the things, the transparency, racial too. Where's the transparency? We had a huge lack of transparency. And the ecology, you already admitted that fight is still going on. But that's a great one because that one's kind of hard to make. The first three, you can easily make a right-left line here today. You can't really on the last one, right? Because we got people being canceled from both sides. We got big tech saying that we want to, collect data on people, and the left and the right don't like that. But then they want to silence certain people, and most people don't like that. We have the machines. We have cloning. We got, concerns of, electric vehicles and self-driving vehicles. How far will we allow that to go? There was a period in there when he talked to unions and said that this was going to replace some jobs. This was many decades ago, and today we're seeing this in that fight. So that fight, like you say, is still going. But to win that fight, you got to be smart about what you complain about. You can't complain about everything, and you can't equate everything to DDT and testing on people, right? Like, I think we would agree largely on a lot of the stuff that Rachel and Norbert were complaining about. But do we address it in a systematic, proper, logical context? Or do we just say, all of technology is bad? And I don't even think Norbert would say that.
No, he wouldn't. He definitely would not. He was just afraid it would be used for the wrong reasons.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and we still are now. So what do we do? What do we do about, to, kind of take the positives of the technology without letting it grow to the level that it's overly abused? I know it's hard to say because people are going to do what they do, right? So what do we do? What's the most that we can do to kind of mitigate it, I guess?
And in our final segment, Jim explains what we can do to learn from what they fought in the 50s without exaggerating the positions that we're in right now. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I've reached my final segment with Jim Gaines, former managing editor of Time magazine and author of The 50s, An Underground History. And here he discusses what we can do to make changes today in our culture with such a strong partisan divide.
I don't know how you would do this, but in order to do it in a country, in a capitalist country, and I'm a firm believer in capitalism, but in the 1950s, there was something called the Iron Triangle, which was the collaboration of politicians, corporations, and financial interests. So let's say that Iron Triangle still exists. If we could somehow balance that for the greater good, which is to say for a planet that survives, or for the life on a planet that survives, the planet will be fine, as George Carlin said. Mm-hmm. We have to somehow incent those groups to take up the same cause. And I'm not sure if that's even possible.
I think the normal citizens, liberal and conservative, understand that lobbyists is bad. They both play the game. But part of the problem is that if I can go and I can convince a politician to side with me, even if I'm wrong because I donated to his campaign, or worse, because I guaranteed him $1 million job on the back end on a board, that's a problem. And everybody agrees that that's a problem. But it's so ingrained in our political system. I think there's too many people that aren't elected that control things. Congress abdicates their responsibility and just says, I'm elected, I'm going to, promote this, install this person to handle it, and then I'm not going to look at it again. So there's things we could do, but I think that in order to do it, the reason it's hard is not because it's hard, it's because we're arguing about the wrong things. We're arguing that it's still the 50s. We're arguing Democrat, Republican. I don't care about either one. I'm not a member of either party because I don't like them both. So where's my voice? Everybody just assumes because I'm willing to say that I'm not oppressed today, that makes me a Republican. No, it just means I'm not oppressed. And I don't think we solve what problems that are being perpetuated in certain groups of society by taking the whole group and saying the group is bad. No, you fix the problems. So I think there's a way. It's just, how do we get liberals and conservatives to talk to each other about issue matters and not just the loud as the squeaky wheels? Because I don't think most liberals agree with the far left. I don't think most conservatives agree with the far right, but they're the ones with the megaphones today. And I think that is the approach. And hopefully if they read your book and get a better understanding of how bad things were, we'll stop having the nonstop talk about how today is the same as it was. To say, to really, whatever your views are politically, to say that we're living in Jim Crow 2.0 is disgusting, right? You want to tell me that I'm moving through my life right now the same as Medgar Evers did? These people had, incredible threats on their lives. These people were killed, right? It's not the same. It's not the same. And I hope that, and I'm definitely going to encourage people to read this and understand that both that's important, and the movements that they think changed the world in the 60s didn't start with legislation, or didn't even start in the 60s. It started with a murmur in the 40s and the 50s and maybe before. And if they want to make a movement now, they need to do the same, take that playbook and do the same thing today, but not do it in such a polarizing political fashion. This is a cultural change and you're not going to fix it politically. But I wish we had more time because this was great. He is Jim Gaines, former managing editor of Time magazine and author of The 50s, An Underground History. Jim, thanks for your time.
Thank you.